flashcard. And for people on Zoom, please make sure to use the Q&A function at the end. Excited for this talk, and now we're going to have Pat Lilly introduce Trish.
Thank you. So I'd like to welcome Dr. Patricia Homan to CSDE and UW. We're very fortunate to have her here today. So Patricia Homan is an associate professor of sociology and associate director of the public health program at Florida State University. Her research focuses on developing theory and measurement for structural sexism, structural racism, and other forms of structural oppression, and examining how these forces shape health in the United States. Her work has been published in the American Sociological Review, Demography, American Journal of Public Health, the Milbank Quarterly, Health Affairs, Social Forces, Social Science and Medicine, Journal of Health and Social Behavior, The Gerontologist, and the Journals of Gerontology Series B, among other outlets. Her research has won multiple national awards, including the 2022 NIH Matilda White Riley Early Stage Investigator Award, the 2022 Early Career Gender Scholar Award from the SWS institution, the 2021 ASA Sex and Gender Section Distinguished Article Award, and the 2019 Roberta G. Simmons Outstanding Dissertation Award from the ASA Medical Sociology Association section. Please welcome Patricia Homan.
Hi everyone, thanks so much for having me. It's really great to be here. Special for me because Dr. Sarah Curran was an early influence in my life, taught me how to do social science research. So it's fun to be able to present my work here today. And I'm enjoying the great weather too. So today I'm going to talk about some new research using demographic approaches to study structural oppression. So just a quick overview. First, I'll give you some background. What is structural oppression? And then what do we know so far about how it shapes health? And then I'll present two new analyses I'm working on now. They're not published yet, so brand new stuff. Would love to hear what you think. And then I'll talk a little bit about how future research can build on these kinds of studies. All right, so first, what is structural oppression? Structural oppression entails systems of discrimination. I'm just gonna go ahead and read this definition because I think it's really important to start with a good definition so you know what we're talking about. Entails systems of discrimination that create and sustain stratification in life chances between socially disadvantaged and advantaged groups. Structural oppression is reflected in institutional inequities, discriminatory laws, widespread cultural norms, and the unequal distribution of power and resources. So measures of structural oppression are designed to capture institutionalized, group-based inequality embedded in all the social structures that shape individuals' lives. So it's really not about overt prejudicial attitudes and behaviors by individuals. All right, and as you know, there are many forms of structural oppression that shape American society, all of which have harmful consequences for population health. Research has increasingly shown these things. Today, I'm going to focus on the two which I have researched the most, structural sexism and structural racism. But I just want to say there's a growing field of research devoted to quantitative measurement of these forms of oppression as features of a social environment in a particular time and in a particular place. And most of this research, well, a lot of this research, not all of it, is focused on quantifying oppression within US state level environments. So why states? The person I would point you to here is Jennifer Karras-Montes. She's done an amazing body of research illustrating how important US states are becoming for population health. States are important administrative, political, and legal units. There's been a consolidation of policymaking power at the US state level since the 1980s because of the devolution of authority from the federal government to the states, and then states preempting of local authority. So Montes has really great work on this. And as you can see, this is a figure from one of her papers. The health and longevity are really diverging across states. So since the 1980s, again, you can see that there's been sort of dramatic changes in a subset of states where we see health not improving compared to the rest. So the first type of structural oppression in state level environments I want to talk about is structural sexism. When I started working in the health disparities area, there was this newly emerging literature on structural racism in health, but there wasn't really anything analogous for the study of gender inequality. A Google Scholar search or just a Google search for structural sexism basically turned up nothing. The gender and health, thank you. The gender and health literature that we had was really focused on gaps between men and women on various health outcomes. And this is absolutely vital research, but it doesn't really account for the fact that both men and women living in a certain social context are exposed to systems of gender inequality and can be both harmed or influenced in different ways. So we need a way of characterizing the extent of inequality, systematic gender inequality. And that's why my work has focused on structural sexism, developing structural sexism measures. So originally, in my first iteration of this, I came up with this measure of structural sexism in US state level environments. I had 6 measures across 4 different domains based on previous research and theory. So the economic and political measures were kind of similar to things people had used at the time to study structural racism. So the ratio of men's to women's weekly earnings, so the gender wage gap, the gender gap in labor force participation, the feminization of poverty as reflected in the female to male poverty ratio. And then also thinking about structural sexism, I had 2 additional domains, cultural and physical reproductive. And for the cultural measure, I used the proportion of the state population that is comprised of religious conservatives. And this might seem sort of surprising, but it's actually kind of a proxy measure, but this is an important indicator of structural sexism because these religious institutions relegate women to subordinate roles in the family and in the church, in their ideology and practice. So it really is about the power that these institutions have in the state level environment. And then finally, I have as a physical or reproductive measure, the proportion of women who live in a county without an abortion provider. Now this measure or measures like it in this domain are becoming increasingly important, obviously, since the whole landscape of sexual and reproductive health has changed post-Dobbs. But this study was based on 1998 to 2012. So right at the very beginning of when we were seeing states implementing restrictive policies related to reproductive health. So I created an index out of these measures. I standardized them and created a sum. And you can see from the map kind of how it plays out. This is the average across the time period I studied. The highest states were Utah, Wyoming, Mississippi, and Louisiana. The lowest were Maryland, Vermont, Hawaii, and California. And so what I did was I connected these state level measures to individual level geocoded health and demographic data from the NLSY 79. Since then, I've also connected them to the health and retirement study, the BRFSS. So any data set where you have individual variables and you have a state identifier, you can connect them. So what I found was that let's see, here we go. Yes, that living in states with higher structural sexism was linked to more chronic conditions, worse self-rated health, and worse physical functioning, actually for both women and men at midlife. So everyone is healthier in a more gender equal context, and we can talk about that. The effects are slightly smaller among men, which makes sense. That's all I want to say. Oh, so let's see. So after this study, there are several others that have sort of built on this work that looked at structural sexism in health with this similar type of state level approach with kind of similar or some often exactly the same measures of structural sexism. And so based on this work, we've seen it linked to depression, eating disorders, unnecessary C-sections, barriers to healthcare access, decreased preventative care use, infant mortality, men's mortality, and domestic violence. But virtually all of these studies have focused on early life or midlife. So the extent to which structural sexism shapes the processes of health decline and mortality in later life are relatively unknown. So that's kind of what motivated one of the new projects I'm working on right now, which is structural sexism and life expectancy across US states. So in this study, I used demographic methods to try to quantify the population level toll of structural sexism on health and longevity in the US. In order to do that, I combined these same measures of state level sexism that I just showed you with individual health and mortality data from the health and retirement study. And I use this to generate multi-state life tables, estimating active, disabled, and total life expectancy at age 50 as a function of sexism exposure. And I'll explain in a minute like how I did that. Because I think as demographers, you'll probably be interested, like, how did you do that? And give me some feedback on what you think about it. Okay, so a little bit more about the data. The sample comes from the health and retirement study, like I said. I used the 1998 to 2012 years, which is the same years that I had every 2 years, a sexism measure. So it lines up with the observations. So I have 8 waves, 68,000 person spells. So I broke it up into, you know, at the beginning of one wave to the next wave, whether they had a change in their health status, which I'll explain more in a minute. I have the geocodes to connect them to the sexism exposures at the state level. Okay, the measures I used, I adjust for age, race, gender, education, income, marital status, and year. And then my main variables that I use are ADL disability status and death at each interview wave. So, you know, ADL is eating, bathing, dressing, toileting, walking. If you had any difficulty with those, you're coded as having a disability. And then at the state level, I have the sexism index I told you about, the poverty rate, the Gini, the racial composition, and southern region. I just have those as like standard controls I use in almost every model because that's kind of just what everyone does in this work, and it's what I've been doing. But in my next project, I've given the controls a little more thought, so I'll mention that when I move on. But for now, these are sort of a standard set of state level controls. And my analytic approach. So what I did is I used a discrete time hazard approach using multinomial logistic regression to predict the probability that a person transitions between these various health states, between active with no ADL disability, disabled, and then dead. And they could transition back, obviously, but not from dead. Okay, and so I used, so I predicted this as a function of those covariates I told you and the level of structural sexism people were exposed to within their state level environment. And it's so for each year that this is recorded, it's the state they currently live in. So that's where they get the value of their exposure. And then I calculated predicted probabilities from these models for a theoretical individual at the highest and lowest observed levels of sexism exposure in my sample, with all the other variables held constant at the mean. And I stratified it for men and women. So then I used those predicted probabilities to construct multi-state life tables and generate life expectancy estimates using the transition probability at each age from 50 to 100. And then I needed confidence intervals on my estimates. So I bootstrapped coefficients from the covariance matrix and then repeated the life table calculations 1,000 times to get a mean estimate and then an 84% confidence interval. And like I said, I stratified by gender, so I did it separately for women and men. I think this will all make even more sense when I actually show you what I found. But are there any questions about what I did? Does that make sense?
I have a question.
Okay, yeah.
So on the state, is it, so the state measure that's attached to the record is for the record of the year for the record that the individual in HRS and not Ed. So but you don't know necessarily where they lived before.
Right. That's right. So it's their current state. It's not adjusting for their like cumulative exposures over the life course. But it is like, at least we know that they're actually there right now and they're not, and like between waves. Right. But actually that's gonna come up and be interesting for my second paper that I'm working on, because I think it's really interesting to think about movers. All right. And like lifetime exposure too. Oh, but also, actually, I did account for that somewhat. Hold on, it's on my notes that I was going to tell you. So to account for the possibility that sexism exposure affects the likelihood of an individual arriving at age 50 with or without a ADL limitation, I did use the model predicted probabilities of having no ADLs at 50 under high and low sexism conditions to like apportion the radix. So it's a population-based table, not a status-based table. But I will say that it actually doesn't make that big of a difference because since 50 is so young, not that many people have ADL limitations at 50. So it didn't, the population-based table versus a status-based table look pretty much the same. But I did account for it in some way. All right, so here are some results. This just shows you the transition probabilities across age for the high and low sexism. This is just for women first. So on the left, you have the probability of transitioning from active to disabled across age. For the high sexism is the orange and the low sexism is the yellow. And so you can see there's like, you know, a pretty big difference, especially at these sort of later ages. And then here's the probability of transition from disabled to dead. Really not much of a difference here. And I'll come back to what I think that means and how it affects the life expectancies in 1 second. Okay, and so then I use these transition probabilities to create my life tables, and here are my calculations. What I found is that for women living in states with low versus high levels of sexism or low levels of sexism, they have a 6.5-year longer total life expectancy than those living in states with the highest. So remember, this is like the highest versus the lowest observed over that whole time period, 1998 to 2012. And this difference is driven by active life expectancy, as you can see. And there's no significant difference you can see in the disabled life expectancy, which was in line with the plot that I just showed you. And this suggests, oh, I shouldn't have showed you men yet. Yeah, there's the plot. This suggests that preventing the onset of disability is really where interventions can be effective. Because once disability occurs, the structural sexism in one's state of residence isn't really an important driver of the timing of transition to death. But you can also think of like ADL disabilities as being like so severe that people don't, like once they're having trouble with eating, bathing, dressing, like they don't live much longer after that. All right, so those are the results for women. Here's the results for men. We do see a similar pattern, but the gap is half of what it is for women. So men living in states with low levels of structural sexism have a 3.6-year longer total life expectancy than those exposed to high levels of sexism. And again, it's driven by active life expectancy. And although the main thing I'm interested in is within gender comparisons, like comparing women exposed to high versus low levels of sexism, rather than comparing women to men, I think it's still interesting and worth noting that because structural sexism has a larger effect on women's life expectancy than men's, the gender gap in life expectancy that favors women is smaller in high sexism environments because women are doing worse, right? And they would have been doing like significantly better. So the gap is even wider, like women perform even better relative to men in terms of longevity in low sexism environments. I think we see this in like an international context as well. All right, so conclusions from this work so far. From these results, I conclude that structural sexism is associated with a substantial cost to the population in terms of active and total life expectancy. And just what I found, similar to what I found in my previous work, looking at midlife health outcomes, structural sexism is universally harmful in later life, meaning that it affects both men and women. And then finally, given that the US ranks like 50th in the world for gender equity, these results suggest that structural sexism potentially could be contributing to the US's life expectancy shortfall relative to other developed countries. But what about people who move between states? In the life table study, I capture that to some degree, much more than the previous work that's really just cross-sectional, that looks at one point in time, that like a lot of the other studies I showed you were based on. But there's still a lot of interesting questions that arise when we think about migration patterns and how they fit in. So I'm working on a new project with collaborators at FSU and Duke, Matt Hauer and Tyson Brown, to ask the question, how does oppression shape migration across states, so interstate migration? And so some background for this, we know that structural sexism and racism are linked to worse health. Several different health outcomes I've listed there and told you about already. But this raises questions about selection into and out of states via migration based on a desire to escape oppressive environments. But as far as I know, there's no research yet that's actually asked this question that's connected sexism and racism measures to migration patterns. But there are a couple of competing hypotheses we might have. So for example, it's possible that there are high rates of migration out of the most racist and sexist states as people seek more egalitarian environments in which to live and work. But it's also possible that racism and sexism oppress marginalized groups to such an extent that even if they do desire to migrate, they might not have the ability to do so. And then there's also a possibility that it doesn't really matter. It's not associated with migration patterns in any way. But really, whether there is an association is so far unknown. So in this study, we use census data and administrative data from various sources to examine the association between state-to-state migration rates and racism and sexism in US states in 2000, 2010, and 2020. And these questions, I think, are interesting to understand migration in their own right, but they're also interesting to think about how it might relate to research on the health effects of state level environments, depending on what we see. So how am I doing on time? I don't know, probably okay. So we use IRS data with state-to-state migration patterns in 2000, 2010, and 2020 to construct a data set containing 6,000-ish state pair years between which migration occurs. So every set of states between which people could come and go. And we use the measures of sexism I already showed you, and I think, have I listed the racism measures here? Oh yeah, I'll show you them in a minute. I do have them listed. Structural racism is only available for 38 states, and that's because the other states don't have enough Black people to estimate these measures effectively. So almost all research on state level racism relies on a subset of states. Okay, and then for each state pair year, we measure the independent, dependent, and control variables for both the origin and the destination state. And so this allows us to examine state level factors that influence gross migration between states. All right, here's the measures. So the sexism measures are the same exact ones I already told you about. For racism, there are several more. There's 9 measures across 5 societal domains that include economic, political, criminal, legal, educational, and then residential segregation. These are all Black-white inequality ratios, except for disenfranchisement and political participation, which are Black disproportionality measures, and then the segregation, which is a dissimilarity index. And like I said, we have these measures for the past 3 census years. And here's what the patterns look like in 2010. I didn't make a figure yet for our whole the average across the 3 census years. You guys should do that, but this is the midpoint year, 2010. So things to notice about this are that racism tends to be higher in the Midwestern and Northern states, which is pretty consistent with a lot of other previous research, except for cultural racism, which tends to be focused in the South, and interpersonal racism. Sexism is highest in the Southern and Rocky Mountain regions. And there's actually a relatively weak to moderate negative correlation between racism and sexism, at least as they're manifest in state level environments. This is also something we found when we looked at structural intersectionality. I have a paper on that in the Journal of Health and Social Behavior. Okay, so the measures we use, the dependent variable is the raw number of migrants moving between a state pair in a given year. The covariates are population size, year, whether a state's part of the South, poverty rate, and Gini. So those are like the standard ones. But then we were trying to think about what else might be relevant for migration, state to state migration. So we also added, and you can tell me what you think of these or if you can think of others, the median age in the state, the job growth in thousands in the state, the GDP, Republican majority in the state legislature, and then the geographic distance between the state pair. And we use Poisson regression because it's counts of migrants. So, all right, results. Yeah.
Is it not, are the migrants disaggregated?
No, so that's one of the things, like it's just to aggregate like my gross migration flow. So we don't know anything about who is moving or like why or anything like that. So that's one of my like disclaimers at the end. Like there certainly might be a way to like get ACS data and start to break these out better. But this was our first attempt. And so, I mean, that's one question I have is like, is this publishable on its own or does it have to be paired up with more individual level data that lets us parse out the groups? So that's something I've been thinking about. Okay. And this is like brand new. This is the first time I presented this anywhere. So y'all definitely like give your feedback and feel free to ask questions or make comments. So this is a visualization that shows you the migration flows between quantiles of sexism. So the highest in red down to the lowest in dark blue. I mean, it's kind of a lot to look at. But I guess I'll give you a little bit of interpretation while you sit there and stare at it. So there's lots of migration from the lowest to the low. If you see that big blue streak going across, there's a lot of migration there. But very little from lowest to middle or lowest to high. That lowest to low is the single largest migration flow. And also there's very little migration into the highest category of racism, into that red group. Like you can see the tiny flows going into there. And the largest one is from high sexism to other high sexism. So it's like within that same quartile. And this is just bivariate. So this is not adjusting for any of those factors I told you about yet. We just kind of wanted to see what it looks like descriptively. That's just for sexism. I haven't done a figure like that for racism yet. But here are some models. So let's see, model 1 is just everything I've told you about, but model 2 has an interaction between the origin and the destination. I'll kind of talk about what that means and show you some pictures to help sort of unpack that in a second. But the first thing to notice is that both racism and sexism in the origin and the destination decrease the odds of migration, or I guess to interpret it correctly, a 1 standard deviation increase in destination sexism is associated with a 27% decline in the incidence rate of migrants. So essentially, people are less likely to move into or out of the more racist and more sexist states. And there's also no interaction between sexism and racism, which is not that surprising based on the geographic patterns I showed you. So it seems like the effects here are independent and additive. And these results for sexism look the same if we remove racism from the models, and then we can use all 6,000 state years. It's pretty much the same. But then model 2 here is the best fitting model, and it has an interaction between origin and destination sexism. So the effects depend on one another, which we can figure out because we have the state pair rather than just a state. So let me show you what that looks like. Here is another way of looking at this. So this shows you the predicted number of migrants across the range of origin and destination levels of sexism on the left and racism on the right. So these come from the model 2, the interaction with all of the variables held at the mean. So if we look at the table on the left, the sexism table first, The interaction effects between origin and destination sexism indicate that most migration occurs between low sexism states. So right here, right? Here's the origins across the top and the destination sexism, this is in standard deviations, is across the bottom. So you can see the highest levels of migration are darker in darker colors. You can see that most migration is happening there. Very little happens, or not none, but little happens from high to low sexism destinations, or from low to high. And then when migration does occur into high sexism states, so over here, it's basically from other high sexism states, you can see right here. And we have sort of the same patterns for racism as well, but they're slightly less pronounced, the effect's a little bit smaller. Here's just another way of looking at it, visualizing it to get a sense of this interaction. This is just for sexism, because it's showing you the exact same thing I just showed you. But essentially, if we look at the destinations with high levels of sexism, that's the orange line. There are very few migrants across all levels of origin sexism on the x-axis. But if you look at the green line, you can see that for, let's see, for low destination sexism, there are a good number of migrants and they're coming from low sexism origins. Or, yeah, am I saying it backwards? Okay. All right, so to conclude, there's very little high to low or low to high migration is one of the main things I noticed. And what that suggests to me, I was kind of thinking through, and I'm still thinking through, like what this might mean for health disparities work. And what that suggests to me is that current exposure is a decent proxy for past exposure if longitudinal data on state of residence isn't available. If people aren't moving from high to low or low to high states, then maybe like where they're at, like a pretty good estimate of what they've been exposed to, unless the states are changing dramatically over time, which they change pretty slowly. But I haven't shown that to you. And then also that, it suggests to me that the associations between health and state level oppressive environments are not driven by healthy migrant selection processes, whereby healthy people might leave behind racist and sexist environments to pursue more egalitarian living arrangements, leaving the most unhealthy people behind. And that could be sort of driving it. And I sort of assume that that's not the case based on these migration patterns that we observe. And then also kind of a broader implication is that, there's this widespread assumption, I think, popular assumption that people will just move if they don't like what's going on in their state, if their state is passing new laws or is, acting crazy like Florida. But our findings suggest that oppressive environments might be barriers to migration, and they're kind of sticky. Perhaps people are kind of stuck there, and then that can sort of exacerbate some of these problems. So I think that suggests that maybe we should be more thoughtful and careful about kind of this attitude of writing off people who live in certain states. I mean, maybe this is a little personal for me, but every time something wacky happens, people are like, saw it off, send it to the sea. But perhaps the people who live there don't appreciate the policies or the environment that they're feeling stuck in. And maybe we can be empathetic towards residents and help advocate for change. All right, so some limitations here. My analysis does not capture specific law changes, right? These measures I use of racism and sexism are more about the climate. I would consider them measures of like discriminatory context rather than specific laws, but people are developing new measures of laws that are racist and sexist laws, so you could do that. And anti-LGBT law, that's another thing, we'll get there in a second. They also don't capture specific or small migrant populations, so we can't know who's moving. So I would say that these conclusions don't necessarily apply to the LGBTQ+ community. And that's because there are specific laws that are targeting the health of trans individuals and don't say gay laws and things like that. And I don't think we would be able to observe that in these migration flow patterns because there's such a small population of people who would be leaving. You kind of just get lost in the noise there. So I think that's an important issue to look at in the future, but trying to figure out what data we have to do that is another question. And then it doesn't capture, of course, anything about individuals, their behaviors, their motivations, or anything like that. So I can't really speak to whether people are aware of the racism and sexism in their environment or not, because it's like in the labor market and it's in political representation, but how much is it in their consciousness? Who knows? All right, so those are the two new studies I've been working on. So how can future studies build on these emerging lines of research on structural oppression? I have a couple different ways I think we can build on it. So first, there are several ways we need to broaden our inquiry. We can expand and refine our measures of structural sexism, structural racism, and all the other structural isms, right? There's a lot of folks working on various kinds. I guess I list them later on. Heterosexism, cissexism, ableism, nativism, ageism, like people are working on structural measures, a lot of them at the state level, sometimes at the county level. A lot of cool stuff going on with the measurement, but I think we need to keep doing that. And I know I can speak to my work specifically, the sexism measure. You know, it just began with 6 items across 4 domains because that was the data that I could get. But there's so much room for creativity and out of the box thinking in terms of how we can capture systemic gender inequality between men and women in power and resources. So we could add things like labor market returns to education, workplace authority, policies like paid family leave, divorce and tax law, prevalence of sexual violence, you know, new state laws restricting bodily autonomy of people who can become pregnant, right? The list goes on. So I think there's a lot to be done to develop new measures. And then also at different levels, so not just states, but counties, neighborhoods, workplaces, things like that. The other thing is we need to broaden our outcomes. I showed you there's a handful of studies, research that shows some effects on different health outcomes, but there's a lot we haven't looked at. So I just have started working on life expectancy, but that's not published yet. There's nothing I've seen on biomarkers, maternal child health, and a lot of other things too. And then like thinking about structural oppression approach beyond health. So how is structural oppression related to other things that sociologists and demographers care about, like migration, but also marriage and divorce, relationship quality, fertility, educational attainment, self-esteem, maybe consumption, leisure, like there's so many things that we could ask. And then I think that demographers have a unique skill set of perspectives and methodological tools that can make really important contributions to this field. You know, the work I showed you is just 2 examples today of really using demographic techniques to start to unpack questions about structural racism and sexism. And I think there's a lot more opportunity in the future, and hopefully some of you all will do some of this work. Even though, you know, in the past, I'd say there are times when demographers have shied away from explicit references to oppression and isms. I think that's changed. You know, increasingly in demography, you're starting to see some of those words pop up in articles. All right, and then thinking intersectionally. So in addition to racism and sexism, thinking about and measuring all these other systems and then how they intersect. So we had developed a structural intersectionality approach, but it was really just intersectional in its analytic approach. Am I talking too long? I have no idea what time it is or how long I've been talking. Okay. Sorry.
You're not over there. Don't worry.
Okay. Watch on. None of these computers have a thing. But the analytic approach was like measure sexism, measure racism, and then see their intersections. But the measures themselves were not intersectional. And so I think that like we can think creatively about ways to incorporate intersectionality into our measures, into our analytic approach, into our sampling strategy. There's a lot more to be done there. And one example of that is our heteropatriarchy paper, where the measure is intersectional because it captures anti-LGBT and anti-woman, you know, that connection as structural heteropatriarchy. And then applying a life course lens, like Sarah talked about, is really important. So I feel like this work is just starting to go there. People are just getting the data over time. And like, I know there's one structural sexism, study that uses like a cumulative measure to look at eating disorders, but there hasn't been much of that, but I know people are working on it now. So we can ask questions about different life stages that might be sensitive periods for exposure. We can talk about duration and accumulation of exposures and how that matters for health. We could talk about intergenerational effects. So there's a lot to be done here with incorporating life course perspectives as well. And that is all. Thank you for listening to me.
We had one question online, and I am trying to figure out if Ian, can you hear me? I'm gonna unmute you, and if you want to come on and ask your question.
Great, thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. I feel like actually you answered this question a little bit in your closing remarks. And thank you for that. It sounds like you have another paper that addresses this. And also loved everything so far. But I'm a non-binary person, and I wonder if you could speak a little bit more to the way that you think these results might apply to trans people and gender diverse people. And I know especially the sample sizes are really small. So how are you thinking about that, say, in the paper that you talked about structural heteropatriarchy? Thanks very much.
Okay, so that's a good question. So there's lots of questions in there, so I'll just pick a couple and kind of speak to some of them, because there's like the migration issue, how it affects health, how I'm dealing or not dealing with it. So my original formulation of structural sexism is really like binary, like man, woman, because that was like the kind of data that we have. But I know that there's some great work. Actually, a student that I know, grad student in Texas, is working on sort of developing that better for coming up with measures for trans people, because you could definitely think about the same way that I've measured sexism, but it affecting or not affecting cisgender or trans individuals in various ways. But you can also think about measuring it in a different way. You can think about anti-trans policies. Specifically, is usually that's just grouped as part of like structural stigma measures against LGBT populations, and it's not usually looked at just on its own. Usually it's kind of like a cluster of like anti-LGBT policies. But so there are people doing work on that. I haven't done enough of it myself, but the heteropatriarchy paper was really a combination of what we would consider, it's not cis heteropatriarchy, because we didn't have any measures of anti-trans policy. We only had like anti like gay and lesbian policy basically, and it came from the ad health data. I think Wendy Manning and colleagues had a supplement to the ad health that had some measures of state level anti-LGBT policy, and then we combined those with measures of sexism and saw that they were really highly correlated with each other. And then we said, well, gender theory is that, heterosexuality is like the linchpin of gender oppression, so maybe we should think about these two things together. And so that's where we came up with the structural heteropatriarchy. But I will tell you that in that paper, we did an interaction effect to test, like, because we're looking at, does heteropatriarchy affect birth outcomes? And we tested whether it affects LGBT women's birth outcomes differently than other women, and we found no interaction. So it was, but maybe that's because the population size was small, but it wasn't super small. So I'm not really sure. But I guess it kind of makes sense, because the LGBT women would also be affected by the sexism and the reproductive rights policies and stuff like that. So I don't know where you could get data to do the migration model. I really don't. Maybe someone else does. But to have data on like trans people, and if they're like fleeing Florida and Texas, like it seems like they are, I'm not really sure.
Thank you for your presentation. I'm just wondering how you think, or why states like Washington have low structural sexism and high structural racism. How do you think about that?
Yeah. Oh, yes. So she asked, why do some states have high racism and low sexism and vice versa?
How does that impact health? Because it's like counterbalancing mechanism.
I know, it's very weird. I'm still thinking about that quite a bit, and we reflect on it a little bit in that JHSB paper on structural intersectionality. But one thing that helped me kind of make sense of it, or something that I'm thinking about, is that I looked at just the correlation between Black political representation and women's political representation. I found that those were moderately negatively correlated as well. So it's almost like there's a set amount of space that perhaps white men will allow to be devoted to women or minorities. But like that's sort of the way I like interpret it, right? Like it could be filled with women or it could be filled with racial ethnic minorities or maybe Black women, but like it doesn't seem to like that's like it seems like they're opposite and that's why they're negatively correlated. You could also think of like Evelyn Nakano-Glenn's work on like the racial division of reproductive labor and just this idea that like, you know, as women, basically racial ethnic minorities could be employed in like domestic service or low wage occupations or like back of house occupations, allowing women, like white women, to sort of advance professionally. I think we've seen like a lot of evidence of that. So I mean, that could be part of it too. Is that actually so I mean, you would think that more egalitarian places just have this egalitarian ethos that would be, if they're less sexist and less racist and like those things would be highly correlated. But that's just not what we found, at least in the way that it's playing out in these state level institutions that we measure. It doesn't mean that it's playing out that same way in people's attitudes or anything like that. So that's another thing I'm thinking about. But yeah, it's kind of a puzzle.
So student by definition of distribution structure, sexual and gender racism.
Oh yeah, okay.
One thing we talked about a lot was this sort of measurement issue. So, you know, using the indicators like the census indicator, essentially consequences of structural sexism. So then people say, well, let's use the policy, right? The policy drives the indicator. But then, of course, there's probably some feedback. So I'm just wondering how you thought about the measurement. It's such a hard thing.
I haven't thinking about that. Oh, okay. Can I repeat the question? Let's see. My best way of summarizing the question for my folks online is like, how do we think about these variables that are like evidence of structural racism or sexism in a context versus like policies that might create these outcomes, and how we think about the way they're connected and stuff like that. Yeah, so thinking about this a lot because in 2 weeks I'm going to Syracuse for a mini conference on state policies and health. And I'm a little bit stumped because when we think about like, so we recently did a review of different ways that people categorize or measure structural racism, structural sexism, and structural LGBT stigma for an article that's coming out in the Journal of Marriage and Family the next month. And we kind of developed these categories, like buckets of types of measures that people use. And one is like the context, one is like the policies, and then one is like these attitudinal measures. And there's a couple more, there's like events and historical stuff too. But those are the three main ones. And I think you're right that most people stick to one or the other ways of measuring. They don't combine them, but increasingly I think we are seeing some people combine like the contextual sort of effects of inequality versus like the policies that create them. But my issue is that it's really hard to distinguish, because if you like, let's say you have a policy that like, you know, well, let's just say abortion's illegal. That's pretty straightforwardly anti-feminist, like sexist policy that directly affects women. So I would want that as a measure of structural sexism. But I also think about any policy that inequitably distributes power and resources, whether it's intentional and explicit or not, could be considered a measure of structural sexism. But then also the amount of sexism that already exists in these sort of social environments, institutions, the kind of measures we get at, like proportion of women in state legislature, that's gonna drive the policies that get made, like you said. So it's all very intertwined, and I think my answer is terrible. And it's not, I don't really know yet. I don't know what to think about it, but I know that we need to ask these questions more and try to also look seriously at how to think separately. Because like I said, people aren't really using them together very often, or just throwing in one. Like I'm kind of doing that. I'm like, oh, let's throw in some more like anti-abortion measures into my sexism index, because that's clearly sexism. But it is like a different kind of measure, like you're saying. So I think that's actually one of the biggest issues that we need to think through. Hopefully I'll come up with something brilliant by next week.
I have a question about the migration piece. So I understand that you're accounting for sexism, including economic sexism and the potentially differential labor opportunities
Yes.
between sexes.
Yep.
But I didn't see anything in the analysis that's looking at economic opportunities on a state by state basis.
Oh, well,
And I guess I'm just curious,
we
like,
have the, and maybe you don't think those are the right choices. We have job growth as a
So-
measure of something that would draw people to the state and then
Okay.
GDP and then poverty rate.
Okay.
Is there something else?
no, that's helpful. I just wasn't sure when you were showing what you're showing, how the covariates make it into that and whether those were being adjusted for. And what we're seeing is that the net sexism in the job market say, but not necessarily accounting for these. So I just didn't.
Yeah, so those are just dumped in there as controls, not very thoughtfully, so I don't know if like I should do something different, but that's kind of what it is so far. So what you're seeing is how racism and sexism in these state level institutions is shaping migration net of what you see there.
The second question I had about this, thanks for that. I didn't realize from the results that these were being baked in. But looking at sex differences in the migration.
Oh yeah, I can't do that because we don't know anything about the migrants at all. But I guess a question for someone who's an expert in migration, there's got people here, because this is the first time I've ever had a paper where the outcome is migration. Usually I look at health, not always, 90% of the time. I think that most of the this is the question for the migration expert. Do women migrate by themselves very often across US states, or do they bring their partner and family?
That's what I was thinking, and then also the different kinds of economic sexism in different labor markets that might motivate labor migration, right? You were talking about this, like, you know, maybe it's that white women are advancing, and so we're creating this new underclass of people to do these types of jobs.
Yeah.
But do people migrate for those types of jobs? Right? Or
I
like
mean,
that
and
kind of
that's
thing.
why,
I think that with the ACS, you can see that, see the composition, this just like
gender and race composition.
Migrants. So I could get at it. I haven't worked with the IRS net data.
I have no idea why we chose that. I think because you could see both states, like where they came from
Yeah.
and where they were going, and that's the migration expert.
And
That's what he
you
said
don't
on
have
that.
uncertainty.
Right.
But I do wonder descriptively, like as a pairing with what you've done.
Yeah, that's what
Maybe
we were
kind of-
thinking about. We were like, can we publish this by itself, or does it have to become this monster that has like a whole another analysis in it, and then we have to send it to AJS and wait like 5 years. And then it won't be helpful to anyone by the time it gets published. Have that happen. But maybe, I mean, it would sure tell a better story.
Well, this is great, really enjoyed it, it's fun to see your next work. Really exciting. Work. I was thinking about your idea around exposure, and I was just trying to think about some, for your the first picture, not the migration.
Right, the life tables.
Yeah.
Like, should it be the year before?
Yeah, I was wondering if you're already showing really important results. I'm just wondering about, things that are going to knocking over my head to be just because at the state level, some kinds of places like the state of Washington, which is kind of a weird state in your data, strikes me as a place where you've got a lot of people on the western side of the state, very urban, kind of urban environment, and then the eastern part of the state, which is quite different. And so by averaging, I'm wondering if you're really, masking a lot of inequality that might be quite important. Most of our urban population drives our, most of what you're going to see but the other thing I was thinking about is purple states, like wondering if you could do something with red, blue, purple states that might be kind of revealing, especially if there's like a history of changing patterns that you could tease out, trying to I didn't really thought too much, but. Playing around with these places that are kind of teetering over the last few decades.
Yeah.
To then to affect men's and women's life expectancy.
Interesting. Yeah. I don't know about how to think about the purple states and stuff. I mean, because it's a little bit weird to think about because it's not, I'm not making like state life tables, right? It's really just like people, I'm capturing their exposure by capturing the state that they live in and what the characteristics of it are, but I haven't really got at the political characteristics very closely. So figuring out a way to think about and include that maybe to see how that would affect things. Because right, like these are like hypothetical estimates, but I mean, life expectancy always is. But I could definitely think about adding urban and rural in the model somewhere, because I did see there was someone at PAA who presented on sexism, and there was some kind of interaction with rurality where there was like a double penalty or something. I missed the session, I'm so sad, but I'm gonna talk to her and look at whenever it gets published. So I think that there is something interesting going on there. In rural places, it's like even worse. It's like these effects are larger, but I'm not sure.
Smith's work, who spoke here at the beginning of the year, I'm familiar with him, but he looked at life expectancy rate effects in Texas, but divided out rural places into whether they were agriculture based and have these like long histories of basically the plantation in them, or the other types of rural places, which, you know, might.
Interesting. Yeah, for racism is super relevant. Yeah. It also kind of like the life expectancy gap is so big. I'm almost just like, oh, are these even believable? But I mean, I guess when it's like hypothetical and you're controlling everything else and predicting at the highest and lowest levels. But,
Okay, we are at time. Thank you so much, Trish, for the great talk. Yeah, students, if you're ready for class, come right in, and if you're interested in having questions, and I'll come see you at 2:30.
okay, great.
Great. Yeah, I also like, so I developed spatial small area estimation. So of course, my first question is like lower, smaller, like lower, just to get at some of that. But I'm wondering too, like in the life expectancy stuff.
There we go. No one asked the question of why we should expect certain effects among men. I'm just gonna
Are you waiting?
Introduce myself. I'm Kyle Crowder. You have dinner with me tonight? Yeah, I have some questions about opportunity structures for migration.
Oh yeah.
Since I get to a dinner.
Yeah. I'm excited. I don't know anything about migration. This is my first foray.
So that's how you know it. Yeah. Different, and you're putting in the model. No, not the migration, on the first project. On the first project, that like kind of what Sarah was getting at with the over at large spaces. There is a level difference, not to mention. I don't know, I was kind of, it was hurting my brain to think about it. It was hurting my brain to think also about, like in Alabama, as someone from Alabama, I don't appreciate that. It's all of those places. Oh, y'all hear me? What is this touch part? We're trying to yeah, you get my if you go to 6 seminars. Then it is some of the feel like yeah, I guess that eventually are maybe, you know, I think I do know that.
had breakfast and lunch, and then I had to I think they did the same thing. Oh, it's fine. It's fine. It's easy. Like, yeah. So yeah. Yeah.
So she's happily share whatever they want to share. What? Did this at the council? Yeah. Yeah. I told her about your paper. She's like, I think I know that. I think I've seen that paper.
Yeah, maybe to like Nepal, yeah, also like hosting the
prepared situation in session or with some prepared situation changes. And you compare things before.
yeah.
Gosh.
Round around my way.
Thank
Where are you?
I just started my third semester yesterday, so.
Okay, good.
Yeah. It's a thing. Yeah, so I guess.
Feeling less tired.
Maybe? No, I think I've
take care.
I peaked a second and now I'm slide again. Yeah.
I think when I taught Trish I like have no memory. She's reminding me.
Okay, I can punch it next time. I know you can hear.
Oh.
That's the only. Yeah, yeah.
All right, shall we head to lunch?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Like put a control for like rate of change over time in the independent variables. Interesting.
That's a good idea.
Yeah.
Sorry, guys.
Good idea.
I'm holding up your lunch.
Do we just, are we just done with this?
Like the low, once she closes, I.
Oh, okay. It'll
Okay. Like, I don't know, I feel like if you adjust for economic stuff.
For
you
what?
wouldn't expect to see that.
But like what economic stuff? Cause like that's what happened. I lied. I thought I said I hadn't presented it. I kind of presented it to like a small working group at FSU. And that was where I got those controls from. Cause at first I just had like the standard ones I use in the health studies all the time. So all I had was like poverty, Gini. Oh, what do we do with this computer?
I bring it home.
I just had like poverty, Gini and stuff. And so that's when we put like age and job growth and
Yeah.
GDP and Republican
Age
control.
composition or age of the person?
No, median age of the state, so age composition of the state.
Yeah, I always think about like that kind of, the reason people don't leave is either economic opportunity or attachment to a place,
Right.
which you cannot really measure in something like this. But I would have not expected that. I don't know what you were expecting, but after adjusting for like job market stuff, I would not have expected so little migration between low and high places.
Yeah, I don't know.
I think it'd be interesting to see rates. I know you did counts, but just rates,
Rates. Okay.
migration rates.
I'm sure we can.
And
do
also Matt's done like network, like he's looked at networks, migration networks, and I think that's also possibly important. Like if you've already got sort of a system, a migration system in place,
that.
and that migration system might be a reflection of past oppressive, and so I think that's
Interesting.
I found myself thinking a lot about the Great Migration as you
Yeah.
were presenting this, because like we know that the pushes and pulls weren't the story there, right? There
Well,
had
and
to
the
be-
interesting thing is that in those like great migration destinations, that's where some of the highest institutionalized racism is
Yeah.
today.
Right,
Because we keep them
exactly.
out of the institutions where they are.
So we know that these things that are so intuitive now.